For years, probation staff have carried impossible workloads. They've worked unpaid overtime and sacrificed their own well-being to keep the service afloat. Napo has repeatedly put forward solutions, but meaningful change has failed to materialise. With our Workloads ballot now open, I sit down with Ben and Ian to discuss how we reached this point, why workloads are one of the biggest threats facing probation, and why members' votes will determine what happens next. Okay, so in one sentence, how would you describe the current workload situation?
Describe it in one word, which is awful. In one sentence is it's been bad for a significant number of years and it shows no signs of improvement to the level that we think it needs to be at for members.
Well, I would say it's dire. And along with the staffing vacancies, we're hearing more and more about. I think 34% in London was one example on the latest stats. It isn't showing signs of getting better.
So tell us about what we know about staffing. How many vacancies are there across the service?
So the issue with that is the information from the employer themselves previously was that they were thousands of staff short. And even if their calculations are correct in terms of the changes that they're making and the work incoming and outgoing, are still going to be hundreds of staff short potentially. But those sort of wide ranging figures don't really indicate the significance of the problem in regions. We've got regions where sort of probation practitioner vacancy rates are running at sort of 20-25% and more in some areas, and the impact of that is really significant. We've got sort of unpaid work supervisors, where there's a third more staff needed. The liaison officers, where it runs between sort of 10 and 20% of the staff needed in some regions. Really important jobs, as is every job in probation, but that's got a massive impact on vacancies and the work that's done, because the work keeps coming in and the employers show no interest in setting sort of workload caps or trying to stem the flow of work, in contrast to what they've done with the prison service and the cell spaces there. So that's the impact of vacancies, is that work keeps coming and the employer's view is that needs to be done by somebody. So rather than trying to stem the flow of the work, it's just a case of, right, there you go, get on with it.
Yeah, because I was going to say to you, if those posts are empty, how is all of the work being done, or is it?
I mean, in some cases it isn't, and we need to be honest that despite the best endeavours of members and the wider workforce, you simply cannot do the amount of work that's needed to keep this service exactly where it expects to be. So we know that there are hundreds of thousands of hours of paid overtime being done by probation staff, but a much more significant amount of unpaid overtime being done. And that's feedback from staff in a range of different functions, range of different regions. So we know it's not just focused in one particular area. We know it's across the board. And I guess that's not surprising given the sort of the commitment and the vocational nature of lots of the work that we're doing, the feelings that we don't want people to feel as if they're being let down or disadvantaged, and people have got a strong sense of responsibility. But that it does come back to bite us essentially, because there is a level of exploitation being done by the employer. They're fully aware that this unpaid overtime is being done, and they have accepted that and tacitly supported people doing that to try to keep the probation service in some sort of meaningful way.
This sounds quite dangerous. I imagine that there's things that could happen or may have already happened because the workforce is exhausted and overstretched.
It's incredibly dangerous, and just to the point of sort of overstretch and exhaustion, it's really clear that we've got a significant number of people who are suffering from burnout, and you see that from the employer's own statistics on mental ill health and the strong contribution of work-related stress to that. That involves sort of 100,000 hours of days lost to sickness, and that's really significant, obviously, and it's massively concerning to us as a trade union, and it should be concerning to the employer too. But even if you're in work and you're experiencing that level of burnout and you're trying to cover an unmanageable workload, there is an ongoing fear that you are not going to do a particular task that is then highlighted in a review of work that's done. If there's a serious further offence, if there's a domestic homicide, if there's some sort of safeguarding inquiry later down the line, and that is a burden on staff, as well as just the feeling that they're letting people down and they're not doing the job that many of us love to do. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, we're putting ourselves at risk professionally trying to fill the gaps that the employer's allowed to develop. And that's really significant. I know that lots of union reps up and down the country have represented people who have been put into capability disciplinary processes for this union's point of view, completely ridiculous circumstances because they have workloads of 150 plus and they're trying to manage those workloads to the best of their ability. But if things are missed, it's not because somebody hasn't been bothered to do it or has forgotten to do it, but often it's that people are simply too overstretched to do it. But this isn't just about sentence management. This is across the board. This is in every different function we're talking about here, about a fundamentally exhausted, stretched workforce, just trying to survive almost from minute to minute when they're in work and also outside of work.
So, in answer to that question, we have seen in many instances reports of Majesty's Inspector of Probation into serious further offence reviews. We have seen how the finger of blame is tends to always be pointed at individual practitioners, when in fact there's not enough attention paid in such cases to the problems that people face on a daily basis in dealing with difficult situations, difficult clients, and in a Ministry of Justice where all parts of the organisation have yet to be properly joined up. So if people are under pressure already because of things like that, and then they're facing more and more cases because there aren't enough staff or there's not enough experience in a particular location, it's inevitable that things will happen. And we've tried to spell that out, and increasingly people do understand that more and more when we're able to get that message across. But in addition to the HMIP reports, you've got any number of parliamentary questions that have gone in. We've had debates at the Justice Union's parliamentary group, and everyone that we speak to is absolutely appalled that there's no tangible progress being made on workloads under these circumstances. So things will get worse. And I want members to think about that when they consider how they're going to vote in this ballot.
One of the things that horrified me is member testimony about how the work follows them home. What would you say is the cost to the home life, health, and well-being of members who are regularly working late or taking work home?
It's massive. I mean, it becomes all pervading. And I guess the examples that I've took personal example for me is, it was something where I was working as a probation officer. So it was this. It seems really stupid when you think about it, but it's really sad. It's when you would hear a police helicopter going overhead, and you'd start to think about people on your caseload, and had you seen somebody that day, or had something happened that day. It's about kind of as well seeing stuff in the news about if something's happened, if the police are looking for somebody, if you see a sort of CCTV still, you start thinking to yourself, is that such and such? When did I last see them? Do they know anybody in that area? And it's that's the way the sort of the job and the pressure of the job kind of seeps into your life essentially. And we've talked before about the sort of impact on mental health and unpaid overtime. All that sort of stuff destroys people's lives, and it does leave people completely broken. We've seen, and I've seen people I've represented who've left on ill health retirement, that the reason they're retiring is essentially the job has broken them and has meant that they can't function in work full stop. So they will not work again in their working life because of what this job has done to them. That's an incredibly devastating thing to see, let alone experience. That's the impact, and that impact doesn't just happen to the person, that happens to people's families, that happens to your friend networks. It's seen right the way across the board that this is what overwork and excessive work actually does. It is destroying our members' lives, and it's impacting much more widely than their own lives. This doesn't just happen to us. Our overwork impacts our families, our friends, our loved ones.
So how has it been allowed to get into this state? What have HMPPS and ministers been doing or not been doing about this?
I mean, a consistent pattern of not heeding clear warnings from trade unions, from other stakeholders like the National Audit Office, like the Public Accounts Committee. I mean, to be fair, the state of the probation service doesn't just fall on this government or the current set of leaders in HMPPS. This is a sort of historic thing lasting the better part of 20 plus years in terms of where we're at as a probation service. Some people, I think there's a strong case that there should be criminal investigations for misconduct in public office because of how this has been mismanaged. I think there are some people who've quite clearly sat there and have just thought for the benefit of their own career, then they have just allowed this to happen. And they've ignored clear warnings across the board. And it's sometimes it has felt as if the only people who believe that HMPPS is actually pushing forward and making a positive change in terms of when it comes to the probation service is a very small group of people sitting within HMPPS and who will not listen. You're literally talking eyes covered, fingers in ears, just refusing to acknowledge the truth as everybody else sees it and the reality that everybody else sees it. I think it's absolutely impossible to say that people don't get how serious this is. And we've seen some change in how the employer's seen that lately. We have seen some acknowledgement. The issue is, though, that the prescriptions that they put in place, the remedies that they're suggesting in terms of particularly the workload issue, just don't go far enough, don't go fast enough in terms of giving some real hope for change. The trade unions have put in workload relief plan after workload relief plan, and so far they just aren't being picked up by the HMPPS and receiving buy-in from ministers.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's like a fundamental difference in ideology that Napo as a trade union and our members have from the people that work there, or do you think there's something else at play?
I mean, I think it's just a sort of it comes to the point where it feels sometimes it's just a refusal to acknowledge reality, and I think that's what members continually feed back to us. That's what we saw from the sort of the pay discussion earlier in the year with the indicative ballots that we had. There was this idea that they were being presented with a reality they just did not recognise. We see the same thing when it comes to health and safety, given the incidents that have taken place in Oxford and Preston and the remedies that the employers talk about putting in place there. There's this idea that there's just a refusal to acknowledge or even listen to what the people who are doing the job day to day are telling people about the changes that they need to see. It's not even as if it's a case of, yeah, we agree, but we just can't afford to do that. We're not even at that sort of level. It's just a case of, we hear what you're saying, but we're going to do this thing differently instead because we think that's best to do. I don't believe it's ideological. I believe that we've just got two fundamentally competing views in terms of what the way forward is on a big range of issues, whether that's pay, whether that's workload, whether that's health and safety. And that's the challenge for us as a trade union at the minute, to represent our members to this employer and this and previous sets of ministers.
Well, workloads have been an issue for our members for some time, even before unification of the service. And what we're seeing now is a result of a deliberate policy of underinvestment by successive governments. This one admittedly has found 700 million per year for the next 3 years. But what we're saying is that is not being translated into staffing on the ground. It's not encouraging people to stay in the service. Many new trainees are quitting after just a few weeks and months. And of course, as we said before, the impact on longer serving members with decades of fantastic loyal commitment to the profession is wilting because they just can't cope anymore. So underinvestment is the key here. And this is why we're pushing at ministers regularly and through Parliament to try and get this policy of underinvestment reversed.
So we know that there are some people who may be topping up poor pay with overtime, or people who are doing unpaid overtime because they can't bear to leave clients in the lurch or are worried about the repercussions of work not being completed. But in propping up the service in this way, are they unintentionally giving the employer a get out in addressing pay and workloads in a meaningful way?
So I guess, I'd frame that in a different way. I'd frame that in terms of exploitation. This employer knows that it's exploiting. It goes beyond even goodwill of its employees. They know, because of the amount of unpaid overtime that's being done, because of people's commitment to the job across the probation service, that they're getting away with it. They're getting away with not paying people reasonable sums, not having reasonable workloads. And the employer's position at the minute is that they're not even going to tell people what they think a reasonable workload is. So it should be called what it is, which is exploitation. And it's not just a recent thing. This is exploitation over a period of years. This is millions of pounds lost from people's pockets that they should have been receiving. I completely appreciate the fact that people are doing paid overtime, that people feel as if there's a need to do that people are trying to do the best for the people they work with, for the communities that are serving. But I think it comes to the point where people need to recognise the exploitation and say, am I prepared to spend the rest of my working life in this organisation being treated in this way? But also, am I prepared to take a stand on behalf of the people I work with, for the communities that I serve, to do something differently in the future? Because unless we take this sort of collective action on paying workloads that we've taken on paying, that we're talking about taking on workloads, that this isn't going to change. We've seen all the evidence from this employer is they are perfectly happy to maintain the exploitation of the workforce for however long it takes. They will not change tack. We've tried always to work through reasonable suggestions, consultations, engagement, whatever you want to call it, hundreds, thousands of hours of union time spent doing that, and we're no further forward on the issue of workloads. That's why we come to the workforce, and the membership and say, we need to do something differently. We need to talk about the possibility of taking industrial action on this, because we genuinely do not believe there's anything else will work at this stage to deliver that sort of meaningful change where you're not being exploited. You'll be able to do the job to your best of your ability with decent pay and reasonable workloads, and your communities are better for it, because it's widely accepted that probation is the best sentencing option for people, the vast majority of people, when it's done right. I think we have to say that it's not being done right now, not through any fault of members of the workforce, but because of the organisation, the structures and the bureaucracy that we're working. Thanks.
I think Ben's got it absolutely spot on in terms of the angle of exploitation, because successive governments over the years have relied upon the goodwill of members and staff to actually work through difficulties. Look, everybody goes the extra yard. That's a fact of life. But there has to be a limit to that. And the amount of unpaid overtime that's been thrown in, let alone the amount of overtime that's being worked, it is phenomenal. And for every free minute that a member of staff gives the employer, that mitigates against our campaign to fight on behalf of members to get staffing levels up, to get a reasonable workload ceiling agreed. And we are running out of road. Ben is right. We have invested hours, weeks, years engaging with the employer on a whole range of workload issues, with very little traction indeed. And I've seen the missive from the chief probation officer just the other day. These are things which kind of you'd expect her to say, but I've looked through it carefully 2, 3, 4 times, and I can't see that translating into any tangible result for members. It's kind of the cavalry are over the hill, they'll be here tomorrow. Well, that doesn't work anymore. We've got to have some real flesh on the bones here in terms of what it is the employer is able and willing to do to help people manage their workloads. And one thing they ought to be doing is discussing urgently with us what is a reasonable ceiling of cases for someone to hold at any one time. Now, I know there are complexities in terms of the types of cases that people are dealing with. I get that. But it ought to be a mechanism that can be agreed to give a benchmark for people to feel that their workload is reasonably fair under the circumstances. That even in itself isn't happening, and someone needs to wake up and smell the coffee in the senior leadership team.
So I guess that brings us to the indicative ballot. Why now more than ever is this so important?
The vast majority of Napo members who are going to be asked to vote in this ballot are the same members who voted in the indicative ballot on the 4% pay offer earlier in the year. And I want people to think about that, because the strength of feeling on that rejection for that 4% was what got members the 6%. Now, I know there were a proportion of members who didn't accept that 6% as well, but the point to make is that we would not have gotten that increase, that 50% increase in the pay, if that wasn't for that indicative ballot. And members can be reassured that it shows that when Napo members act with a strong collective voice, it can bring about change for them. We apply exactly the same approach to this indicative ballot on workloads. We've got as far as we can get, we've got as far as we can possibly get in terms of trying to work with the employer to suggest changes. There are huge changes have taken place. There are huge changes coming, which we think will increase workload in the probation service. And I went to the Justice Union's parliamentary group previously and said that I think this next sort of year coming really does bring an existential crisis for the probation service and for people who work in the probation service and who value probation as an ideal. Because I think that's the position that we're currently in. This really is sort of make or break territory for us, we believe, at this point. That's why we need members to vote on this and to vote in favour of industrial action to try to wring more changes out of the employer as it currently stands. Members are concerned about their workload, but too often this kind of feels as if it's a sort of individual issue. and people don't feel as if they can act collectively on workload issues, that it all falls down to them to deal with, and that kind of contributes to the sort of impact on people's mental health. What we're saying to members really loud and clear at this stage is there is an opportunity to do something together on workloads and to fight for something, and to take back probation in a very real sense in terms of what we do, how we do it, and the value that we place on it. That's what the indicative ballot means, and essentially that's what we're asking people to vote for industrial action on the indicative ballot, so we can go back to the employer and say, you need to think again about what you're prepared to give us in terms of the very reasonable requirements that we've put in for you to do over the coming weeks and months.
This will be the fourth ballot in just around 12 months that we put before members. Not bad for a union that has only taken industrial action about four times in its history. But we're not about industrial action as the first port of call. We are, as we've explained time and time again, about trying to reach an agreed solution with management. But in the absence of that, what I say to members wondering about why we're balloting yet again is, well, what else do you expect us to do? Well, Ben and I can bang the table, we can shout loudly, we can be forceful in the discussions that we have. But at the end of the day, Ben is right. It's the collective strength of members that counts. That is what is going to change minds. So, yes, it's a tough ask again. And I understand all the issues that members are going to be thinking about over the coming weeks. But if you want to help us improve your conditions, if you want to help us make tangible progress in terms of getting more staff into your PD so that people can manage the workload better and help the clients more effectively, then you'll have to vote in this ballot. I'm sorry, there's no other way around it. And I'm being brutally frank with you here. And we need you to vote. We need you to vote yes to the prospect of being balloted for industrial action. That may not happen. However, we have to have that in our armoury in order to maintain pressure on the employer. And Ben has quite correctly referred to the strength of collectivism that we saw when we balloted members on the paltry 4% pay offer in the early part of this year. And the overwhelming response from members, it drew gasps from other trade unions, I can tell you, that I met with at the TUC General Council when they saw the turnout we'd achieved and the no vote against that offer. That proves we can do things if we stick together. And that's my rallying call to members and ahead of this ballot. Thank you.
So I guess there may be some people that are worried about taking action, like we've touched on. They might be worried for a variety of things, losing their paid overtime, what happens to clients when they stop working, or just because they think things may never change. What is your final word to those members?
The final word of those members would be, how else are we supposed to do this? How else are we supposed to bring about any sort of substantive change for you, for the people you're working with, and for your communities? We have got to the end of the road in terms of discussions, negotiations, whatever else you want to call it, on workloads. The employer has made it very, very clear what its view is, and its view is essentially that it'll continue to exploit members. It's made it really clear that it wants to sort of remove any sort of measure of workload and what an acceptable workload is. So I guess people need to think about that, about saying, I'm worried about the people that I'm working with and my commitment to them. Well, what does that look like 6 months down the line when the employer's removed any measure of workload for you and is continually dumping more and more work onto you without any sort of recourse? And for you to go back and say, well, actually, your figures say that this means I'm overworked. That's the issue people need to face in terms of the overtime. The overtime's being extended, but it's not a guarantee. And do we want to be a union that says that overtime is the norm? Or do we want to take collective action on workloads and, if required, on pay to mean that people's pay is such that they don't have to rely on using overtime? That's part of what we're talking about here. It's about that collective action to try to force change because we don't have any other option at this point in time. If people think things are never going to change, you're right. If we keep doing nothing in terms of taking industrial action, things aren't going to change. But if we say loud and clear as a membership that we're prepared to take industrial action, because that's all this indicative ballot commits people to, that you're open to the possibility of taking industrial action at the future, and then there'll be a formal ballot on industrial action after the summer, that's all we're asking for here. The people are open to the possibility of taking action to make changes because we don't have any other options. And that's what I'd say to those members is just be open to the possibility, strengthen the union's collective voice and vote yes in the indicative ballot.
So again, this is a question of our options are running out. And what we do know at the moment is all the attention of ministers and senior leaders is how we're going to deal with the increasing number of clients coming onto the books as a result of the Sentencing Act initiative and the big the big issue that they're worrying about right now is how are they going to organise all the electronic tagging that's necessary. Now, that's important. We get it. But what about the staffing? So is it that they're doing this big review about the ability to tag people ahead of actually understanding and showing some responsibility in terms of how staff are going to cope? Or is it that ministers are just being told, we'll manage, minister, and all you've got to worry about is how many tags are available for clients? Well, if that's the approach that's being adopted, it's pretty short-sighted, I have to say. And in that scenario, I repeat the point, what else are we expected to do but try and maintain pressure on the employer? And Ben has said it, and I'll say it again, this is about indicating your willingness to enter into a campaign of industrial action. Now, we hope that may not come about. It may, because the employer has a obligation to listen. But that's where we are, and it's important that people take part. It is an indicative ballot. Please take part. Please vote yes to the question. Thank you.